So I have a notification that says we've started.
Yep, now live streaming.
Yes.
You're all set, Rick?
Almost there.
Okay.
All right, we're live.
Okay.
Okay. We'll call this meeting to order. And I will turn the meeting over to Superintendent Thomas.
Thank you. So when we talked at the board meeting last week, we talked about, we had originally had this meeting scheduled, and we talked about whether we should push it back or continue to have it. And it was our feeling, Meg's and my feeling, that we should continue to have this meeting. We have had opportunities to take a look at the budget based upon the funding that the governor has offered, and to take a look at other issues. We have picked up some additional information to let us, to give us a better sense of where we might be going forward in 2021. Meg has scrubbed through the budget, I know, to take a look at the figures to make sure that we're okay with those. And she's she tells me she's fairly confident, not fairly confident, she's confident that the numbers are good. And so we thought that we should show you what we've got so far. Now, I just want to make it clear to everybody that we're not approving a budget tonight. We're not asking the board to approve a budget tonight. As a matter of fact, due to the fact that everything has been pushed back, we don't actually even know when the vote is on the budget. We know it's after June 1st. That's all we know at this point. The governor will probably set that date for us, and then we'll run all of the dates the way we're supposed to. But we just don't know exactly when that voting date is right now. My thought, though, and this is only my thought, is that we may know by the end of April what that voting date might be. And so I'm thinking that we may be coming to you in our first meeting in May to ask for an approval of the budget. So if you take that into account, today's the 14th of April. We're going to show you some information, and that gives us a couple weeks, 2 to 3 weeks, to still think about whether or not some modifications should be made on the budget. We're making a couple assumptions here, and Meg will share those with you as she goes through the slides. And we're just hoping that you'll listen, take some notes, and then we'll have an opportunity to react. If not tonight, then at another time. We just wanted to give you the information right now so that you knew, had something to think about and to work with going forward. So with that said, I'm going to turn everything over to Meg. If you all set, Meg?
Yep.
Okay.
Okay, everyone should be able to see my screen. If you click on the top of the grid that has the different video views, if you click on the second rectangle, it'll show just me if it's overlapping the slides, just so that you can see them better if you choose to do that. Or just whoever's talking. I also seem to have some trouble with the audio on my laptop, so I'm going to try to talk slowly. And I'll stop periodically to see if there's any questions, and let me know if you can't hear me. So as Larry mentioned, a fair bit has changed since the last time we looked at the budget. Currently, the proposed budget for next year is $21,577,412. When you compare that to this year's budget, it's actually a decrease of 0.8% or $168,000. We looked at this slide when we met a couple weeks ago. The only thing that has changed is this last column that now shows that the proposed budget for next year is the 0.8% decrease. But you'll see that in recent years, the budget increased each year. And given what we're projecting for state aid next year, we're actually looking at a decrease in the budget. Any questions at this point?
It sounds good.
So this slide just shows a comparison of the various categories of revenue. The black bar represents the current year's budget, and the orange bar represents the proposed budget. So you'll see that the proposed budget has a slight increase in property taxes, a slight decrease in state aid, a slight decrease in other revenues, and also a slight decrease in appropriated fund balance. So with the exception of property taxes, all of our revenue categories are decreasing slightly. This slide we looked at again previously. The only column that has changed is the 2021 column. You'll see here the increases that we've had in tax levies in recent years. What's included in the draft budget is a 2.41% tax levy increase, or $161,000. That is within the cap calculation. So it's in compliance with the tax cap. It is over 2%, which I know is not necessarily where we want to be or desirable, but given the cuts that we had to make the budget balance, and the additional cuts we'd have to make, what is proposed here is a levy just slightly below what's calculated under the cap.
Meg, could you talk a little bit about the calculation that goes into the levy?
Sure. So we look at last year's levy as well as the amount, or the current year's levy as well as the amount that we are planning to receive in pilot payments. That gets increased by the allowable factor, which this year was, I think, 1.81. There's also some things that we're able to exclude, primarily capital. So we look at what our capital expenses are for things like debt, bus leases, capital outlay project that we're planning. And also new this year is capital that we pay BOCES for their capital expenditures. We then compare those expenses to amounts we receive on state aid for those expenses, and the difference is an allowable increase under the cap.
Thank you.
So this slide shows us a comparison of state aid from the current year's budget to next year's budget. You'll see on the very first line, which is foundation aid, that they're holding that flat for next year. So the 10 million that we're receiving this year is the same as what they're saying is our allocation for next year. Previously, under the governor's executive budget, we were anticipating an increase in that. But with the changes related to COVID-19 and the budget that was adopted by the legislature, that's been held flat. Other aid categories are mostly the same. There's some projected decrease in our excess cost aid, which has to do with students that the cost of their education is above a certain threshold. We do have a slight decrease in the number of those students. So correspondingly, the amount of aid that we're projected to get is going down a little.
And that's primarily students with disabilities, right?
Yes. Here under other state aid, we have that $30,000 that we previously got through Senator Bonasic that we're no longer receiving. It was a line item grant that he had ensured was included in the budget for the district. One other item that I want to point out here is these are our projected aids based on the legislative budget. The one that concerns me the most is still transportation aid, because much of that is an expense-based aid. So the aid that comes next year is based on how much we spend, in part on how much we spend this year. And we all know that not doing 2 bus runs every day, our expenses are going to be lower. The actual amount for transportation aid, if you look at the printout from the state, is 1.3 million. They have communicated to me in email that they believe that is $162,000 too high based on the issue with the bus leases. So you'll see here that our number is adjusted down. And it may be even lower than this based on where this year's actual expenses come in. Also included in the legislative budget is what they're referring to as a pandemic adjustment. So what that says is that they were planning to decrease Walton's aid by $537,333. However, the state is planning to use federal CARES restoration aid money that they're planning and hoping to get from the federal government to make up that difference. So for our proposed budget, we've assumed a net impact of 0. So the budget assumes that the federal aid is received by the state and offsets their negative planned pandemic adjustment. And it also assumes that New York State doesn't reduce our aid beyond the pandemic adjustment amount. The state has instituted 3 time periods during the year when they can look at state revenues and expenses and see where they are in line with the state budget. And based on the results of that, they could further reduce our aid beyond this $537,000 pandemic adjustment. We have no idea what that number might be. We don't know if it would be $50,000 or $500,000. There's no guidance or information. So in talking to a lot of the other business officials, this is the approach they're taking in their budget. They are assuming that the amount that the school's aid will be reduced is the amount of the pandemic adjustment, and that will be made up by the CARES money. What many districts are doing, and I've started to do for Walton, is creating a plan that if our aid is cut further during the year next year, what adjustments could we make during the year? Those things that I have on that list include items like changing healthcare benefits. Excelis has indicated that normally they don't allow benefit changes during the year, but that they would allow mid-year changes. So in conjunction with the unions, we could come to an agreement that changed benefits on the health insurance to reduce some costs. Also on that list are some possible layoffs. I know that no one likes to, that's not somewhere we want to go, but depending on if the aid is cut and by how much, that's a potential item. Purchasing freezes on anything that's not absolutely necessary is on that list. Just want to see what else is there. Also, we could make the decision during the year to postpone either the capital outlay project or the overall capital project to not incur those expenses right away. And then we could use monies from fund balance as needed to make up the difference. So those are the kind of, and I can share that strategic plan with you. I've started drafting it, but I can certainly share that. But we want to be ready with certain things that we could do during the year if needed. So I know that was a lot of information. Are there any questions about that?
Meg, I have one. I know at one time you had talked about the BOCES figures, that we didn't really have accurate figures. Have those been adjusted to reflect more accurate figures now?
Yes. We've gotten the final budgets from BOCES, and this draft budget includes the expenses for the services through BOCES at the amount that they're budgeting.
We were considering the possibility of entering into another program that the BOCES offered called the Lighthouse Program. We have since decided not to, if I'm correct, Meg, right? We decided not to do that. So, we've pretty much tried to hold the line on those expenses, and BOCES has pretty much tried to do that this year as well. So we just haven't tried. We just haven't added anything. As a matter of fact, I think we were going to go into the Lighthouse program. We're not going to now, and there are one or two other smaller programs that we're not going to participate in. We looked with our administration as to see how much we're actually using some of those programs. Some of that activity was low enough where we felt like, well, we probably could either have a workaround locally or just not and not participate in the program and save us some funds. So that's another place where we're taking a look at that right now. The scariest thing for us is how much during those triggers in the coming year the state may take away from the budget, and that's one of the reasons you're seeing it built the way that it is, so that we can be ready in the event that the state is going to take away some of those funds. It's kind of like the gap adjustment from a couple of years ago.
Anything else before I move on from that?
I'm sorry, Meg, what was that? I didn't hear
Anything
you.
else before I move on from that?
No, go ahead.
This chart, similar to the one that we looked at a few slides ago on revenues, shows the areas of expenditure in the proposed budget. Again, the black columns are this year and the orange are next year. So you'll see there's a slight decrease in general support. General support is things like expenses related to the board, superintendent, business office, building maintenance, those sorts of things. So there's a slight decrease there. The amount attributed to education, which includes everything from the guidance office to teachers to athletics, is relatively the same. Transportation has a slight increase. I would attribute that to the last tranche of leases that we're putting on. Benefits shows a slight decrease. The rationale for that is that even though we're anticipating a 15% increase from Excelis at this point, the amount included in last year's budget was higher than needed just to meet our premiums, because we were unsure at that point of exactly how things were going to fall out with New York 44. Debt service remains flat, and the capital outlay project, you'll see there's just a small orange bar there for next year, which is the $100,000 capital outlay project. And we didn't have one of those this year, so there's nothing for this year's budget. This slide is very similar. Rather than categorizing the expenditures by the area that they're spent on, the function, it's categorized by the what's referred to as an object, whether it's wages, equipment, paid to an outside contractor, things like that. So again, you'll see wages is fairly flat. Equipment has a slight decrease, and contractual has an increase. BOCES has a decrease. That's not so much because we're changing significantly our service with BOCES. I would say this is primarily attributable to the excess funds we had in this year's budget for special education services to BOCES. Again, benefits is decreasing because of the extra that was in this year's budget. Debt service is flat, and capital outlay shows up for next year. So a summary of, I guess, the highlights of the proposed budget. As I mentioned earlier, the tax levy increase is 2.41, which is within the cap. It doesn't include tuition for the BOCES Lighthouse program that Larry just mentioned. That was a short-term, basically mental health program. We would just continue to meet the needs of the students through the current avenues that we have for that. It does add indoor track. It does eliminate admission to football and basketball regular season games. It eliminates 2 positions through attrition. So we have 2 planned retirements at the end of this year. One is a custodial position and one is an elementary teaching position. And in the budget as presented, both of those are eliminated for next year. The budget does include for the custodial position the promotion of a current individual to the building maintenance mechanic level, but not a replacement after that promotion.
Meg, what is our actual cap?
Bear with me for a second and I will pull it up. I'm going to see what happens when I do this. So it's this B column right here. Can you see that?
Not really. Well,
Yes.
Yes.
So the limit is the 6,843,507 and the budget has 6,840. So the excess that we didn't levy is 3,507. If we went all the way to the maximum, it would be a 2.47 increase as opposed to the 2.41.
okay.
As I mentioned, the budget includes the lease of the last 3 buses. It also includes $15,000 to start a process of classroom furniture replacement. It continues to include the one-to-one device rollout. It accommodates the 15% health insurance. Excelis has come back. You may recall we were originally at 22 or 23. It's down to 15. I know when we went with Excelis, the understanding was that it wouldn't increase more than 10% year over year. However, that was 10% plus any Affordable Care Act mandates. So the Affordable Care Act mandates account for about 2 to 3%, which would allow them under that prior agreement, which was no longer enforceable based on the insurance department, could have had us at 12 to 13%. So we're really only slightly over the maximum that we anticipated. I did only anticipate a 10% increase for the 6 months that we'll have in a renewal on the 65 plus program, and I'm crossing my fingers that that will be enough. In the proposed budget, based on conversations with Larry and Jane, we're shifting a little bit how we use our federal grants, and we're putting more payroll and benefit expenses in the federal grants and moving some of the professional development expenses to the general fund. So it's really just a swap of where they're paid for. And the rationale for that is that we're hoping to be able to procure some of those professional development expenses through BOCES and generate aid on that, which we can't do when we're paying for it with grant funds.
Yeah, when you pay for it with federal grant money, you can't get any aid back on it at all. And this, by just switching places with those, we're able to purchase those professional development services using our general fund money, which we can get aid back on in the following year. So for us, it seemed like a no-brainer to try to generate some funds in the next for the next budget, as opposed to lose that opportunity.
What does that amount contribute to for professional development? What are we talking there?
So overall for professional development, I would say it's about $100,000 between the salary that we pay teachers for the extra time they spend above and beyond to take professional development, as well as the amounts we spend for conferences or consultants that come in to do trainings and things like that. We also have included in the budget the $100,000 capital outlay project. And as we've discussed, we're maintaining our current debt service level in anticipation of a capital project. There's a lot of numbers on this sheet. This slide is to show you a look at fund balance. So you'll see here, does my cursor show up when you're looking at my screen?
Yes.
Okay, so you'll see here for the last 3 years, you were showing actual numbers, and this was the fund balance that we started each year with. And this was the operating surplus or deficit is how we ended the year. So in 2016-17, we had a deficit of 282,000. We used that much fund balance. You'll see in 17-18 and 18-19, we actually had surpluses that added to fund balance. I am projecting that this year, highlighted in yellow, we'll have a surplus of about $200,000. It is very possible, given expenses we're not incurring this last quarter of the year or last semester of the year, that could be higher. If that is higher, what will happen is it will increase our fund balance dollar here, our ending fund balance. So basically, I'm going to bring you down to the bottom here. Fund balance in excess of the 4%. So you'll see here in 17-18 it was 445,000. It grew to 538 and it grew to 582. What I'm projecting here is that it will be about 505. And that takes into account the fact that we moved $500,000 to the capital reserve fund. Now this,
I didn't hear that last part. I'm sorry.
this takes into account the 500,000 we moved into the capital reserve fund.
Okay.
So this 505 may very well be higher if this 200,000 ends up being higher when we close out the year in June. What I like about what this slide shows is the comptroller's office came in here at 582 and said it's too high, and we show that we're making progress towards decreasing that. When we made the decision to move $500,000 to the capital reserve fund, I said that I may come back to you as we get to the end of the year or shortly after the end of the year and recommend more in capital reserve fund. Absent COVID-19, I may have done that. But I wouldn't recommend doing that now, because I think that this shows that we were making progress and taking steps to decrease our excess fund balance. But I think it would be ill-advised at this point, with how much is unknown on next year's state aid, to take that money and put it away for a purpose that we're restricted on how we use it. Because this $505,000 or whatever number that ends up being for next year is available to us to use in case of an emergency. And I certainly wouldn't want us to use all of it, but at least it's there. So I feel like we're at a point where we have to balance the comptroller's office saying you have too much with us knowing that we may have needs next year. And if we get through some of these look back periods from the state and things aren't looking, things are looking okay, then maybe at that time we say, okay, let's put another 100 or 200,000 in the capital reserve fund. But I think doing it now would be a bad idea, because we don't want to commit those funds to something where we can't then use them if needed for operations. So as Larry mentioned earlier, we don't know when the budget vote will be. They talked about after June 1st. But when you work back from the date of the budget vote, we're at a point where we'd have to be doing things this week to actually accommodate a June 2nd budget vote. So I'm doubtful that it's going to be that early. The date of June 16th has been mentioned a little bit, but nothing is official. So obviously, as soon as we get an official date on when the budget vote is going to be, we'll work everything backwards and make sure we meet all the benchmarks accordingly. As Corey or Larry mentioned when we started, we had a community budget forum scheduled for this Friday. That's not a legally required process, but that's just part of our budget calendar as far as being open and transparent with the public about the process. If we were to go ahead with a budget forum at this point, my thoughts of the presentation would be basically what I shared with you all tonight. That's where we are. I'm open to questions or comments or suggestions, or I would appreciate input about how you all feel about this budget as far as possibly being asked to approve it as it sits in May.
One concern that I have, especially now more so than prior to when we were first actually having these discussions, is COVID-19 and how many people have lost their jobs to this and what the impact may be come around the time, that we're going to be looking to put this budget out to the public. What is the potential of reducing that tax levy within a 2%? Is that feasible without cutting programs?
I don't really feel like there's a lot of fluff in the budget where you'd be cutting. I mean, it makes me nervous because we're already looking at the possibility of having to do layoffs or things like that next year if state aid is cut further than the pandemic adjustment, or if the federal funds do not flow through to the state the way that we're anticipating. So yes, it can be done, but it's a matter of making a priority decision at what expense.
Okay.
Part of our strategy going into this was, is the feeling, and it's not just Meg and my feeling, but it's from the conversation of all the superintendents with the BOCES superintendent and with the school business officials. But part of our concern, collective concern, is that as tough as this time is right now with respect to the COVID-19 and the pause and all that sort of thing, that it could be tougher next year for exactly what you're saying, Rhonda. You know, we've got some folks who are certainly not going to be working for a while or are not working now, and that's difficult. So we went at the budget with the notion of trying to preserve as much as we possibly could this year, comfortably. So because we know that next year we may actually be hitting a tougher time, and some of the things that we have tried to hold on to, and if we were to scrub out, those things aren't going to be available to us next time around. And we do feel pretty strongly that next year is probably going to be a tougher year. The year after this coming year, I mean, you know, next time we put a budget together. So that was part of the philosophy of trying to put this together. And we are very worried about the notion that, you know, the way that the trigger points work is if the state has not received at least 99% of what they anticipated, 99%, anything less than that, they can come back to the schools and say, okay, we're reducing your budget. And we want to be able to try to hold on to our program as best that we can. And I think Meg has tried to construct a budget that helps us do that through next year. But honestly, if we are at a point where you know, the governor says, well, we're going to drop your budget by $500,000 this time, and then another $500,000 next time, it could mean some drastic changes for us mid-year. And what we're trying to do is to put a budget together that's going to last, with luck, the entire year.
Due to what's going on and the circumstances that are surrounding us, I really don't know how we can come out with a 2.4%. I just don't think that's going to be received well any way, shape, or form during this crisis. It's gonna appear that it's one more black eye that somebody has to take along the road. So I think I appreciate what you've put into this, Meg, and it's very thorough, and it is very explanatory of where things are going and how. I just caution that we need to see if we can find ways to put money in different areas or just think outside the box a little bit to see if we can get it down, because people are really going to be hurting after this. They already are hurting, and to smack them with a 2.4 increase would just devastate a lot of people. I don't know how we can do that.
I guess my only thought on that is if we could get it down to the 2%, I don't know what that 0.41% actually turns out to be in dollars and cents.
About 30,000.
How many?
30.
$30,000. I personally understand where everybody's coming from and with the people working, but I'm in favor of what they have together, because my concern is the fact of not the 2021 budget, but the 21-22. And I think you're going to have to probably squash the capital projects that we have been working on to go ahead. And if we cut this budget, that's going to already step into our reserves. And I'm afraid in the following year, we're going to have to hit them harder. So when Meg commented on earlier on not transferring much more money over to any of the building projects and having it earmarked, I agree with that wholeheartedly. If any year is a year to get slapped by the controller's office, it's this year for having too much money in savings or set aside for, because I think we're going to need it in the future. But and maybe we'll be wrong, and hopefully the economy turns right around when it does get running, because the first grading period, if you will, on the revenue is September, isn't it?
Actually, April 30th,
April. Okay.
which is part of the reason they're recommending not adopting the budget till after April. But my concern is that April's going to look the absolute worst. I mean, if you look at, we're being in the middle of this right now, and they're going to take 1 month while everything's been closed down. I
Right.
can't imagine that April's going to look very pretty.
No.
Kevin, I don't agree with squashing the capital projects, because I think that is going to put us in a bigger bind, you know, with our roofs and, you know, parking lot and everything else. And we don't have that extra money to keep fixing these things and putting Band-Aids on them, especially if we have a major failure in them. The one thing that I would like to look at is, and I know Meg, you had, that's why I had asked you, how much do we actually have in the professional development? Is there any way that we might be able to cut that by 30,000? I know how important it is, but yet would that be a possible compromise area?
I don't know what Larry's thoughts are. I mean, if that's the board's priority, I can certainly change those numbers.
I'm not looking to really throw away the capital projects today. I'm just thinking that before we look at cutting jobs and we look at cutting more benefits, that affects our hiring abilities and our employment abilities of the people that we have. I just and I don't disagree that the building needs work. That is for sure. I'd like to hold on that if everything was good. But before we go after go to remove staff and those benefits, I just think it's you might better drive through a parking lot with potholes in it than have to start cutting education, because there's not a lot left with, excuse me, 2 positions going already through nutrition. We're going to be getting thin the other way. I don't know. I hate to say cross our fingers and hope for the best, but I don't think there is a silver lining in any of this today.
Are the bus leases going to be a separate line like they typically are for the budget vote?
No. Oh, yes. I'm sorry. Yes.
What's the total on that line?
I think it was in the 200s, 260 maybe.
$52,500 for the year to add those leases.
What
How
was
much?
that?
$52,500. So we pay about $52,500 per year for the lease of the 3 buses. It's $17,500 each. And then the 262 that Corey just referenced is the total over the 5 years.
Okay. And this is our last year of adding. I think I've said that before, and I think you've said that is.
Yes.
Okay.
So going forward, the only increase would be when an old one that's 5 years old falls off and we renew it for new buses, if there's any inflationary increases, but it's not like you're putting the whole amount on. It would just be if it's going from 17,500 a year per bus to 18,500. So you're looking at, you know, a couple $1,000s worth as opposed to 50 that you're adding.
I think the only other thing we can look at is just the capital outlay project, whether or not we can use, and you hate to get into it, but you can put it off and figure out if we have to use fund balance potentially to fund that for the first year, and take that on the chin to generate the revenue next year. But I think that's really the only other logical change we could look at potentially in this. And we don't have to make that decision either right now, which fund it comes from. I mean, is that something we can hold off on to tell where that revenue source comes from, and then see what the state's impact are going to be from the second, third check-in type scenario, and then make a decision?
I'm not sure I'm following your,
So right now we don't have the capital outlay project that was put on there for the 100,000 is in the actual budget itself, but it's not, the revenue source is not coming from the unassigned fund balance. I'm saying, can we put that off and look at that, or is that something that has to be decided on right now?
well, I think it needs to be included in the budget that's voted on. The fact that we're going to do it needs to be included in the budget if we want to do it. I've kind of in my head earmarked that it's coming from appropriated fund balance because I
Okay.
think that helps to justify the use of it, but it's not like this dollar is assigned to that project.
Okay.
But even so, we can include that in the budget, and then the goal with that project was to do it in July and August. We don't know now if that's even going to be possible. We could include it in the budget, and if it doesn't happen in July and August, we could decide in October or November, depending on what's happening, to not go forward with that project. I don't know how that would I mean, that would help to not spend the money if the state aid scenario was really terrible, but it doesn't address the concern about the tax levy now.
Right.
Meg, did we just, was 15,000 the amount that we're budgeting for new classroom furniture?
Yes.
Okay. And what would that represent? Would that, like, how many classrooms? Do you have any idea on that? I'm just trying to get an idea.
It's been so long since we've bought classroom furniture that it's really tough to tell, but I'm thinking 2 to 3 maybe.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that's what we figured when we were working on it before. It was either 2 or 3. And the idea was that we were going to try to refurbish, or not refurbish, but replace furniture, a couple classrooms at a time, year after year, and have that there. Up until this point, there's been no new purchases of furniture. We could use some new furniture for the classrooms, and so that was the idea.
Okay. And I know in past budgets, we had discussed maintenance agreements. Have they been looked at more closely to see if we're in line with what we're budgeting versus what we're paying out on those maintenance agreements? And with me asking that, I don't know what new ones that we have taken on this year.
Right. It could probably be looked at a little closer. And the only reason I say that is because I know this year, recently when John's needed some funds for things, we have transferred out of maintenance agreements. I'd have to look a little closer to see if there's things that maybe happen every other year, or why that might be low. I'm just looking quick. Yeah, I mean, I could review that more closely with John.
Well, like I think Graydon commented earlier, we don't have to make those decisions tonight. And if the first review is in April and we're not looking until mid-June for a vote on the budget, probably.
Well, but you've given us some good guidance here, I think. You brought up a couple areas that we can go back and take another look at. We feel it's pretty tight, but I mean, we can constantly be taking a look if there's something that can be scrubbed. So you guys have given us some good guidance, I think.
Thank you for putting this together, Meg. It's been even remotely, this has been easy to follow. Thank you.
You're welcome. And again, it's just our best estimate based on what we know today. It's going to change many times during the year, and we'll have to be prepared to adjust as it does.
Were there any other questions?
How do you want to handle, does the board have a feeling about the community budget forum? Do we want to wait? Do we want to do something sooner?
We were going to, that was postponed.
Right.
Until we know something more.
I'm thinking possibly holding off just a little bit longer. Maybe even having one more budget workshop so we feel more confident before presenting it to the the budget as, or I'm sorry, as the public as the budget, or we may get feedback, if there's, comments or questions, from them now as well too.
I think after that April check-in, if we can really get together after that, and even if we have to go out in a mass pamphlet or some kind of media that everybody can get a hold of, if we can't get to come together, give them something tangible to put their hands on would be great to digest for the public.
Yeah.
Like the pamphlets that we used to send out,
Right.
something along those lines.
The
And I would-
question came up today on a call that I was on. So the first look back period is the end of April 30th. And we don't know if that's something they'll turn out overnight or if it's something that will take them a week or two to, so we don't know how long it'll take us after April 30th to get feedback as far as what the results are.
Well, I think you touched on something earlier, Meg, when you commented on once we get the date that we have to have the budget vote on, work back from there. Because if you can get into even the middle of May, and I'm just throwing that out there, that at least then we'd have more accurate numbers, or hopefully that's as good as it's going to get before we go there. And the way things are going and the way some of the political wheels are turning right now, there may be difference in how everybody's working in May. There's some scuttlebutt now that May 1st is going to be a change of some of this stuff. So I don't know, that may lessen the blow too. We may have people going back to work in beginning of May or middle of May before we have our vote too, which would help situations.
Well, that's one of the difficult things for us, I think, is that as devastating as this COVID has been, the loss of lives, the loss of jobs, the board still has to be prepared with the budget. So when the students are able to come back, and that's what's difficult, for us, is to be thinking about this budget and the amount of money, along with, what's happening, in our country right now.
And trying to guess what's going to happen for the next year, so you know what your next year's budget can look like, and the year after that. I mean, it's
And then that's why it's a tightrope walk, because we know roughly what we need to carry, certain fixed expenses with regard to wages and employee benefits for our, instructional, non-instructional staff. We have an idea from, all of our meetings of the facilities committee, what we need to kind of build up some of these capital projects so it doesn't hit all at once, to kind of smooth the expenses. But we also have to put out something that our local economy can withstand. Otherwise, not only will it, even if it survives, and passes, it may not be sustained as a result of, lack of payments and things like that. So it's a very tight needle to thread.
All right, so I guess at this time we should probably plan in the future here for another board workshop, and then we'll go from there.
Well, we thank you for your time, and we appreciate you coming out for this extra meeting. But we've been trying to listen to what's important, or what everybody has, what folks have expressed as being important. We've tried to react to that, and it probably would have been a lot easier to react to a lot of that had some of these other things recently not occurred. But it is what it is, and we certainly appreciate you've given us several things to take a look at here, to possibly bring things a little more in line with where you're hoping that we can be comfortably. And we really appreciate your input.
Well, thank you to you and Meg as well for putting this work into the budget, and also for the administrative staff for crunching figures. We appreciate your efforts.
Thanks.
So we need to, if there's nothing further, we need
I
to.
just want to thank Meg. That was the most clear explanation of the budget that I've had. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Yep. We like to see those graphs, don't we?
Yes, we do.
You can thank Larry for that.
Thank you. That was nice.
He
All right.
reminded me that people like pictures.
Yes.
Yeah, I'm a picture person.
All right. If there's nothing further, do we have a motion to adjourn?
All motion.
I'll second it, Marilyn.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Carried. All right. Thank you, everybody.
Good night.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Night.
Good night.
Thanks, Meg.
Right.
Good night, guys.
Good night.